now we got some bonus content. David, you have interests and you've written on the sort of 70s Blaxploitation film era, and there were quite a few Blaxploitation horror films that came out around that time, playing in different subgenres, you know, Blackula, Ganja and Hess, Abbey. If you teach on, or if you were to teach on sort of that era of horror, what would be some things that you would draw on that you want people to get out of it?
You know, that's a really good question, and contextualizing is crucial with those movies in particular, right? So I would definitely draw from Blackula, because I think Blackula is in a lot of ways is sort of the best of that era, and has a lot going for it. And I think it has way more going for it than most people truly understand. And I was fortunate enough, I did a commentary for the Blu-ray release of it maybe 10 years ago, something like that. And I really kind of broke it down. You know, I broke down, like, when you really look at it, there's a lot of like police brutality, and when you look at it, Blackula is actually the hero. Prince Mamuwalde is the hero of this story. He's a very tragic character. You know, you take a movie like Blackenstein and it's the opposite end of the spectrum. It's one of the worst movies ever made, right? So I would teach that as like an example of absolute failure at the genre. And everything else, you know, Ganja and Hess notwithstanding, because Ganja and Hess is its own separate thing. Ganja and Hess, you know, Bill Gunn wrote and directed that. And I think, and I haven't heard anybody say this yet, but I think Ganja and Hess is so far ahead of its time. I don't think audiences have still caught up to it yet. I think that, you know, there's so much amazing stuff to be seen in that movie, but you also have to be careful, like, which version are you watching? Are you got to make sure that you're watching the absolute longest cut there is, because that's the closest thing to Bill Gunn's original vision. But it's one of those movies where it's still like, there's moments where I'm like, what is this about? Like, what am I watching here, right? Like, it is truly artistic, you know, with a capital A, and there's times where it borders on being pretentious with a capital P, right? And it's in terms of pure cinema, it's a way better film than Blackula will ever be. But Blackula is a solid film, and it's a solid film because of William Marshall's performance and what he brought, not just in front of the camera, also but behind the scenes. This idea of vampirism being something of a metaphor for slavery, right? Like, he's fighting slavery as an African prince in the 1700s, and then he gets turned into a vampire, and he gets turned into the monster, right? And then it's about him trying to deal with that monstrosity that he's become in a country in which being a Black man is a monster in and of itself, right? And so there's a lot to be said that, you know, the final confrontation at the end of Blackula is with the police, right? It's crazy, because when I did when I recorded the audio commentary for Blackula, it was a couple days after, I want to say it was a couple days after the acquittal of the cop who killed Mike Brown. And you know, I just remember watching the movie, and the news had just broken, and I was just like, yeah, this is what it is. Like, this is Mike Brown, you know, is the prime example of how society turns Black folks into monsters. And then, you know, and then what happens after that. In terms of other movies from the 70s, you know, there's pluses and minuses to a movie like JD's Revenge. But I feel like in a lot of ways that's more of a failed. Like, I love it because Glenn Turman is great in it, and it has this whole Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde vibe to it, but it doesn't quite get there where it needs to be. And that's sort of the problem with a lot of the movies, was that the Blaxploitation horror movies needed to be like Get Out, but we couldn't get to Get Out until we got the JD's Revenge and Abby and Sugar Hill, and they're all fun. Sugar Hill's really fun movie, right? I would show that one because I think that one's sort of underrated, and also because I suspect that it had more impact and influence than a lot of people either acknowledge or realize, but especially Don Pedro Colley's performance as Baron Samedi as the sort of wisecracking, supernatural entity is like, oh, that's Freddy Krueger. He's Freddy Krueger before Freddy Krueger, right? And so I love that one. And Abby, William Girdler directed that, and Abby, looks like it was shot on a budget of $25. And is in some ways it's a ripoff of The Exorcist, but I love how they worked in, this, African mythology and this African demon of fertility that has possessed this woman and made her an insatiable nymphomaniac. Not a particularly great movie, and Carol Speed in it is just like so ridiculous. But then like William Marshall, who was also in Blackula, as the Black Exorcist, which was one of the titles of Abby, the Black Exorcist, aka the Blaxorcist. I think with a lot of those movies from the 70s, what you're seeing is I don't want to call them failed opportunities per se, because of the time and place they existed. There were no other opportunities, but I see them as stepping stones. And it wasn't until, I honestly do feel that like Get Out might have been the first like film to really truly deliver on the potential of what you could do in Black horror. And that's not to say that there aren't other good movies. I mean, I like Tales from the Hood, but it's like there's something about Get Out that was just there's less for me to pick apart than there is with some of these other films. But going back again, the 70s, I'm trying to think if there's any others that really stand out, and they're mired in the times, they're mired in the expectations. So many of them were produced by American International Pictures, and so there's this low budget, they're driving fodder, and they all, and this is crucial, they all predate Jaws. And Jaws was the first horror film or / monster movie. Well, no, it wasn't the first, because Exorcist did it, but Exorcist and Jaws were the first, really amongst the first B movies that were A movies, right? The amount of money that went into them and the amount of money that they made sort of changed everything. But I'm trying to think if there's anything else from the 70s that I really...
I'd like to move your, you made two different points earlier that I would like to tie together.
Yeah. You
talked about Blackula, right? And then you talked about the sort of African mythology that was woven into Abby. What about Scream, Blackula, Scream? What are your sort of your take on that?
It's been a long time since I've seen Scream, Blackula, Scream. Scream, Blackula, Scream has my favorite Blackula scene in it, which is the scene with the two pimps who accost Blackula, and they say they want some bread, and he's like, "I'm sorry, I have no bread for you," and he's like, "What is he?" I used to have the scene memorized, but then he attacks the two pimps, and it's this. It's the best scene, and then there's a great scene where he beats up a bunch of cops too. Scream, Blackula, Scream didn't know what it wanted to be, and it was never, there was never supposed to be a sequel to Blackula, except it made a ton of money, right? So in typical AIP fashion, a week later they throw it together, and so where I've seen Blackula a dozen times easily, Scream, Blackula, Scream, I've only seen it a handful of times, and and it's like it exists in weird patches in my memory. You know, Richard Lawson with his really bad hairdo, and but that was interesting because that movie, in my memory anyway, that's the movie. The first movie, Blackula is very much the tragic hero of it, and in Scream Blackula Scream, like they lost sight of it, and I can't remember. You know, Bill Crane directed the first one. I can't remember who directed the second one, but I think the combination of Bill Crane as a director and William Marshall as an actor worked to make that first movie have far more meaning than the second movie could have. Okay. You know, and then there's another movie called Lord Shango, which most people have never seen, and I couldn't even tell you what that one's about. Like that one's like that was Marlene Clark and Lawrence Cook, and I want to say Stack Pierce maybe was in that one. And it's funny because the woman who played Marlene Clark's daughter was like 2 months younger than her in real life, and it gets into like this Santeria voodoo sort of stuff. It wants to be Ganja and Hess, but it fails at being that. And I don't even know like if that one's available. You know, that's one I had on VHS for like 1,000 years. I don't even know if I have it anymore.
It would be interesting to because you mentioned Ganja and Hess again, right? So when I watched Blackula and Blackula Scream as like a double feature, that's how it came on the disc, and so I got to watch it both way through, and I was struck by Blackula Scream. Or what stood out to me was this sort of infusion of African mythology and this idea of cure for vampirism. He goes to Pam Grier's character, who is sort of inherited the almost like sort of Caribbean voodoo priestess role. Whereas with the original Blackula, I mean, it was very much like there was like the cross, you know, and like traditional sort of Western Christian vampire mythology. And Blackula Scream started to, at least the elements I resonated with, started to move in a different direction. It would, where maybe Ganja and Hess is sort of, it would be interesting to kind of put the three of them together.
That'd be good. I should sit down and rewatch them anyway, all of them, because again, like there's a publisher talking to me about possibly doing a horror thing, and I'm like, okay, let me study this stuff and see what works and what doesn't work and find it. But yeah, no, I just remember, to me, because there's nothing in the first Blackula, there's the scene where Ketty Lester, who plays the cab driver, comes back from the dead, and she's running through the morgue. Mm-hmm. And it's like, there's nothing scarier than that, right? You know, so and Elisha Cook is the morgue attendant with the hook for a hand. I don't know why he had the hook for a hand. And so that moment in Blackula, and then the scene in Blackula Scream with the two pimps, one of whom was, I want to say, was played by, it was either Tony Brubaker or one of the big black stuntmen in Hollywood. And that's how nerdy I am, is that I know who you are. So
excellent. Well, that's, the nerdiness is welcome here. So